Welcome to the Galloway Law Podcast. My name is Thomas Galloway. Today's episode is slightly different. For a while now, I've wanted to expand the scope of this podcast to include more political topics, and there are a couple of reasons for this. Number one is pretty simple. Many political topics are directly related to law. And number two, and perhaps more importantly, it is very difficult for people to find neutral, nonpartisan political content. And if I in any way can provide people with information about political topics that comes from a place of pure curiosity, of simply wanting to know the truth, then I feel like I have an obligation to do that. So with all that being said, Jonathan Hassid is a professor of political science at Iowa State University. His research is primarily in Chinese politics, and we discussed his paper, Amplifying Silence, Uncertainty and Control Parables in Contemporary China. We discussed the background of this paper, so it is not necessary for you to read it, but if you are interested, it is linked below. We talked about how the Chinese government silences journalists and lawyers, how it censors the internet, and whether or not China is portrayed accurately here in the United States through the media and from politicians. One last thing before we get to the interview. Obviously, this podcast does not have a sponsor, but I would like to occasionally recommend products or services that listeners of this podcast might be interested in. Today, I would like to recommend the app Read Across the Aisle. You can read a wide variety of news outlets, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Fox News. The app shows you where these outlets are across the political spectrum and provides you with constant feedback so that you know if you're getting information from a variety of viewpoints or if you're just getting your information from one spot on the political spectrum. I think resources like Read Across the Aisle are essential if we want to get to a point where people can have civil conversations about politics with each other, so I would strongly recommend checking out that app. If you enjoy this interview, subscribe and share with a friend. It really does help. And now, to the interview. Okay, so before we get too far into the paper, to provide our audience a little context, could you explain a little bit of the background behind this paper, what motivated the research behind it?
Sure. So my co-author and I, she's Dr. Rachel Stern. She's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley in the law school. And she studies lawyers and I study journalists in China. And basically we were interested in seeing what makes all of these people behave in an authoritarian system without much repression. I mean, we think about China as being this dictatorship police state, and that maybe is what it's trending toward. But when we were doing our research, hardly any journalists or lawyers were punished for, transgressions, right, for going too far. And so we were interested in seeing what it was that kept the vast majority of journalists in line without too many punishments. Now, by not too many, I should clarify that China is, or at least was, the world's largest jailer of journalists, right? So at the time we did our field work, there was usually between 2 and 3 dozen journalists in prison at any one time. Yeah. So this is not to say that journalists never get imprisoned, but today there are more than 200,000 registered journalists in China, and so we're talking about a small handful of the profession. So the question is, what kept these people in line, basically? And it turns out the answer is not a simple story of just, the police arrest people or beat people or whatever it is. It's something else going on.
Right. And another question to create a foundation for this discussion, could you explain the basics of how the Chinese government is structured?
Sure. All right. So in China, of course, there's the Communist Party, which is essentially intertwined with the government. So we talk about the Chinese party state. It's a one-party system. It's a dictatorship, and the Chinese government, the actual physical structure of it is very complicated. There's a rubber-stamped legislature, there's a kind of a strange executive branch, there's a not terribly independent judiciary, so we don't really have the 3 branches of government there, right? But what we do have, and what the Chinese government talks about a lot, is rule by law. Not rule of law, but rule by law. So law constrains the population, it doesn't constrain the party state. So in the U.S., we have the Constitution and all kinds of other, laws over the years that constrain what the government can and can't do legally. In China, the constraints are on the population, not on the party state. Okay. So that's what it looks like.
Right. And the paper discusses 2 main methods that the Chinese government uses to silence journalists and lawyers, being one of them being uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain that concept and the connection between uncertainty and control?
Sure. So my work has been on journalists, and so I've interviewed, I don't know, maybe nearly 100 journalists and editors and other news professionals in China. And what they say is that day to day, all right, so let me back up and say everyone knows there are clear red lines of coverage that nobody crosses. So you can't advocate independence for Taiwan in the press. You can't talk about problems in Tibet, right? You can't talk about the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. These are things that are clearly off limits and they will never appear in print. Then there are things that are clearly okay. Most celebrity gossip is fine. Basketball scores, right? Like the NFL, to the extent that Chinese people care about the NFL. These are all just fine. You can report about these, no trouble. But then there's this gray area in the middle where there are no formal rules against reporting about, say, social unrest or a large protest or something like this. But what happens is that if you're a journalist and you write an article and it gets published, and then it turns out that a day, a week, a month, or a year later that some official reads that article and says, uh-oh, this person went too far, then you can be punished for that after the fact. So the punishments and the censorship in China, the formal censorship system is after the fact.
Right.
And what this means is that there's a huge incentive for everybody to self-censor because nobody knows exactly where the limits are on each individual issue, generally speaking. It means that everybody is afraid that if they push up against, if they sort of stray too far into the gray zone, that they'll get in trouble later on.
Right.
And so as a consequence, most journalists in China self-censor, right? Most people stay way back from anything they think could be controversial because they don't know exactly if they're going to get in trouble or not. And this kind of uncertainty, this I think a deliberate climate of uncertainty keeps everybody on their toes.
Gotcha. And then the second aspect being the control parables. Could you explain that concept as well?
Sure. So a control parable, this is a concept that my co-author and I developed, and it's basically the idea of that these are stories that people tell to explain the uncertainty. So if a journalist goes to jail, generally speaking, the party state doesn't say why. They'll announce that somebody has gone to jail, but they won't say what the problem that caused that imprisonment was. And so everybody then goes back and says, oh, was it this article they did on this thing, or was it this article they did on the other thing? And in discussing and speculating why they thought that person X went to prison, they then essentially create rules of their own behavior. They then create their own red lines about what they think the possibility, or where they think the transgressions would be. And so it's better if I give a concrete example. So there was a newspaper and journal in China called the Public Interest Times, which was run by an editor called Chen Jieren, and this was shut down. And Chen Jieren got in trouble. And nobody knew why exactly. And so there was some speculation that he got in trouble because he was reporting on prostitution at one of the major Chinese universities. Other people speculated he got in trouble because he reported on poor quality English translations on government websites. As an aside, generally speaking, the quality of English translations on government websites is often very poor, right? So he was sort of poking fun at this. But the government never said why. And so journalists who discussed it came away thinking, okay, I better not report on bad English translations, or I better not report on, say, prostitution at a university without knowing exactly what the party state punished the guy for. And so and then later on, those became rules, right? Those became sort of informal rules to guide everybody's behavior. They're essentially stories that we tell ourselves to explain random or seemingly random events. So, why did Mike get a job but Susan didn't after graduation? Oh, it must be because Mike did better at the computer science class or whatever it was, right? We don't know why exactly. The universe is uncomfortable and uncertain, and so we come up with stories to explain or think we explain what happened. And so what happens in China is these control parables create and reinforce this climate of self-censorship and uncertainty.
Right. You mentioned briefly about these more subtle methods being perhaps deliberate on the side of the Chinese government. The paper mentions how they have a strong, they are very aware of how being strong and coercive can backfire.
Sure.
So this does seem like it is a conscious effort on the side of the Chinese government.
I think so. We can't prove it,
Right.
Because there's no smoking gun. There's no document that I can point to that says a secret central government document that says we need to create this climate of uncertainty.
Right.
But we can speculate, and the evidence seems to point to the fact that it's deliberate. So, for example, the Chinese to be a legally registered journalist in China, to work legally in the profession in journalism in China, you have to have a government issued press card.
Right.
This press card, to get the press card, you have to, among other things, take a test on Marxism, Leninism, press theory. There's a whole bunch of garbage that you have to do. None of the journalists care about it. They all just do it to get the card so they can work. But the card has no expiration date. And what the government can do is just at any moment can just seize your card, right, and say you can't work anymore. They don't have to give an explanation. They can just say you're basically banned from the profession.
Right.
And the fact that there's no expiration date on these cards and the fact that it's just so arbitrary suggests to me that it's one piece of evidence suggesting that it's deliberate. And in fact, press cards up until 2006 did expire.
Okay.
And the government removed the expiration. And you would think that journalists would be happy with that, but actually what it means is that it's even more arbitrary now.
Right.
There are other examples too. So, for example, China still doesn't have a media law. Journalists and lawmakers have been talking about promulgating a law that says what the media's responsibilities, duties, and laws regulating the media are. People have been talking about this since the mid-1980s. It's never happened. It almost happened before 1989, but then it got squashed. And so, even though academics, journalists, and others want a press law to clarify what their rights and duties are, the Chinese government almost did it, but then backed off, and has since never done it, which suggests to me that they don't want a press law. And in fact, there's a quote from one of the workers inside the Central Propaganda Department that I saw in a secondary source, where the guy was saying basically, if we have a press law, then the journalists will know everything, and so we can't have that. And so all of this, builds together, I think, to create a persuasive case that the Chinese government doesn't want clear lines of accountability, right? They'd rather have it all nebulous.
Right. So beyond the two main methods of uncertainty and the parables, it mentions two more strategies: the coercive repression and regulation. Could you go through how those two are utilized?
Sure. So coercive repression is, basically jailing people, sometimes even beating them. China, as I said before, for a while Iran surpassed it, but I think China's back again as the world's largest jailer of journalists. So there are, if you really cross a red line in the journalism field, you'll go to jail, right? And so that's clear coercion. These are people, essentially they're political crimes. They're people in prison for political crimes. It's not used that much, but it is scary. It's terrifying, right? That people can go to prison for doing their job as a journalist. And we argue that the climate of uncertainty and self-censorship essentially magnifies the quite trivial amount of coercion to seem like a very big deal.
Right.
And in fact, there's a very famous Chinese expression, shaji gehokan, which means killing a chicken and to scare the monkeys, right? If you hold up somebody and you make an example of them, then everybody else gets in line.
Right.
And the Chinese government seems to do this with journalists and lawyers. So that's the coercion side. The regulation side is more interesting and more complicated. So as I said, to be a journalist in China, you have to have a press card issued by the government, which means you have to be at least conversant in Marxism, Leninism, press theory. Even if you don't believe it, you have to take a test in it. So that's one side of regulation. The other side of regulation is that any registered news organization has to be officially sponsored by a government unit who are legally responsible for them. So in other words, if you like, there are no private media in China. There are privately funded media in China that act as sort of quasi-private media, but ultimately they are legally responsible to a particular part of the government. Whether that's the Securities and Exchange Commission, which sponsors one of the famous Chinese financial journals, whether that's the China Youth Federation, which sponsors a major newspaper. They can be more or less distant from the central government, but they're still part of the sprawling government apparatus. And so you have to be cognizant, if you're running a media organization, that you can't piss off your sponsor in the government. That's one side of regulation. The other side of regulation is that you also have to have a certain amount of registered capital. You can't be a poor media outlet. You have to have quite a bit of money. It all has to be approved by the government. And legally speaking, journalists are not allowed to report news with some exceptions on the internet. Right. So that is to say, China's equivalent of the internet portals in the U.S., the equivalent of, say, Yahoo or, I don't know, MSN or something, they're much bigger in China than they are in the United States as a source of news. Those places are not allowed legally to do their own reporting. They're only allowed to do so-called reprints of other media outlets. And so, generally speaking, the online media are not allowed to report. They're not allowed to do original journalism.
Right.
Only outlets, controlled by the party state and sponsored by a party or state organization are allowed to do original reporting. So as you might expect, this tends to make news outlets, how can I put this, happier with the government than they might otherwise be.
Right. The paper you mentioned it a little earlier, how many journalists just stay away from the controversial topics.
Right.
And you mentioned they're focusing on maybe celebrities or sports. Or
Sure.
What else are they writing about? Like, we mentioned there being a lot of gray areas.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other topics they try to write about that gets as close to the line as possible?
Economic news used to be relatively open, given the potential sensitivity of the topic. So sort of before the early Xi Jinping years, so Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. Before Xi Jinping came to power, financial news was actually quite free by Chinese standards. So you could report, and there were a couple of major outlets, one called Caijing and then another called Caixin, which together do really or at least they do less now, but they did really hard-hitting financial reporting. Okay. So, corruption inside state companies, stock manipulation, stuff that could make the government look bad. And this was more or less allowed. Since Xi Jinping came to power, and especially in the last 2 years as the Chinese economy has been really tanking, economic news has become increasingly censored. Okay. And so these outlets that used to have a lot of space to report now have less and less, and in fact, some of the journalists at these places have gotten in trouble relatively recently for reporting on so-called negative economic news. Right. So this is an area where freedom has shrunk, or if you like, the space for reporting is smaller than it was.
Right. So since you published this paper in 2012, what other changes have we seen in China?
From the perspective of somebody who believes in media freedom and supports the right of the Chinese population to know what's going on, all the changes are bad. Xi Jinping has been terrible for press freedom in China. In fact, it would be difficult for me to go back and do the kind of field work that I did today. Of the many dozens of journalists that I talk to, most are not in the field anymore. Most have left the profession because it's too difficult. Right. So they've gone into PR, they've left the media entirely, they're in exile, a few are in prison. And so the situation is quite grim, right? If you believe that a free press is better for China than a censored press, then the news is nothing but bad.
Right. Okay. And as far as, so in the United States, if we follow the news, we pretty much have a general idea what's happening in different areas of the country. Mm-hmm. Is that the case in China? How aware are the Chinese people of things that are happening in different areas of the country?
It's a good question. Legally speaking, Chinese newspapers are not allowed to report outside of their administrative area. Okay. Administrative rank is very important in the Chinese political system, and it's very elaborate. And the rank that a newspaper has is inherited from their sponsoring organization that I talked about. So if you're sponsored by the Communist Party at the national level, as People's Daily is, the major Communist Party mouthpiece is, they're legally allowed to do reporting anywhere in the country. Their administrative rank allows them to do that. But if you're, for example, a county paper sponsored by a county government or a city paper sponsored by a city government organization, legally speaking, you're only allowed to do reporting inside that administrative area. Okay. In practice, people violate this routinely. So there's lots of so-called cross-border reporting, but it is technically illegal. And the idea is that, in theory, if you want to report on an area, so if you're the Ames Tribune, you're not allowed to report on what's happening in Des Moines or Washington, D.C., the Chinese equivalent. What happens in practice, this is designed so that those topics are reported in the newspapers based on the Chinese press agency's coverage. So if you're the Ames Tribune, you want to report on something in Washington, D.C., in China, you're supposed to use the equivalent of you're supposed to use Chinese National Press Organization, right? If you're a Beijing-based paper or let's say Shanghai-based paper, and you want to report on national news, technically you're supposed to rely on Xinhua News Agency copy. This is a way for the Chinese government to control reporting. In practice, as I said, it's routinely violated. But yeah, there are these kind of restrictions on who can see and say what.
Right. Okay. And as far as you talked about what's changed since it's published, what would you expect to see in the future? Can we anticipate anything in particular?
Xi Jinping has made very clear that he's going to continue the media crackdown. He famously, 3 or 4 years ago now, said a colloquial translation would be something like, the media's middle name has to be party, right? So he made it very clear that his view of the media is that the media serves the Communist Party, not the population of China. I think things will get worse. The media environment will get tighter, and in a lot of ways, this is I don't want to say stupid. This is counterproductive to what Xi Jinping is trying to achieve. Xi Jinping's biggest stated political objective is to get rid of or reduce corruption inside the Communist Party. Since China doesn't have free elections, you can't reduce corruption that way. Essentially, there aren't that many ways that a government can monitor corruption, right? You can use the secret police, you can use the media, you can use elections, or you can use the population itself. There are no free elections, so you can't use that. Xi Jinping wants to crack down on whatever media freedom exists, so that will be further reducing the scope of corruption reporting. And so, to a certain extent, what the Chinese government now does is it relies on the internet. And so people can and do complain about corruption online. My local mayor is so corrupt, he has 5 houses or whatever it is. If that doesn't get censored, which it often is, that can then trigger an investigation. But the space for all of this kind of popular and media accountability and feedback is shrinking. And to me, it's a pretty dumb idea. If you want to control corruption, you need to empower the media, not restrict it. And so it seems to me that in the long run, Xi Jinping will not solve China's corruption problem. In fact, it's only likely to make it worse in the long run.
Could you explain a little bit about the censorship of the internet in China?
Yeah, the censorship of the internet is complicated. China has the world's most restrictive internet censorship system. Most censorship is done by the content providers themselves. So the government, as with most things in China, the government essentially privatizes censorship. So the censorship of the media system, as I said, is outsourced to the journalists themselves, right? Most censorship in China is self-censorship because of this climate of uncertainty. So this is a way that the Chinese government can have lots of censorship without actually paying for it. Right. The internet is done the same way. Internet service providers, websites, the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, these all censor themselves, right? They censor, so the government isn't doing it directly, it's done on the companies, which makes it cheap for the government to run. It also means that clever users can take advantage of different censorship systems between different content platforms. So some are more permissive than others, and this allows, to a certain degree, users to kind of arbitrage, to take advantage of where things are loose, relatively loose. That said, the media has been the internet has been increasingly controlled like the rest of the media recently. So in the last 5 years, the Chinese government has published a law saying that if you are an online citizen, a netizen, and you publish a so-called rumor, and a rumor is anything the Chinese government doesn't like, by the way, if you publish a rumor that is that receives at least 5,000 views or at least 500 retweets or replies, that's a prison offense. That's an imprisonable offense. They've also, at the same time, are strongly pushing to have a so-called real name registration system universally implemented. By that I mean they're trying to get rid of anonymity on the internet. They want every internet poster to be personally identifiable. And what this means is that all internet service providers, all platforms are required to know who their posters are. If you want to get an account, you're supposed to show your ID at an office, basically. And so the idea being, of course, with no anonymity online or vastly reduced anonymity online, people are going to self-censor more. Right. And finally, the government is also strongly cracking down on tools to circumvent all of these technical restrictions. So we call it in English the Great Firewall, and it's up until relatively recently, it's been pretty trivial to go over the Great Firewall. You use a VPN. That's the most popular way. You can use Tor, proxy server. The Chinese government has been closing these down, and in the last year they've really cracked down on VPNs. And so what this means is that even the sort of technically sophisticated are finding it harder and harder to get around these restrictions.
Right.
So it's, from my perspective, it's all pretty grim.
Yeah. For these providers and platforms that don't censor to the point that the government would like, would they face some kind of blowback?
Yes, they can get in trouble, they can get fined, or they can get closed. And the Chinese government routinely closes media platforms that what they say violate the laws, including some very popular ones. Gotcha. Or often a big punishment is they'll have to go for a week without any new content. And you can imagine if, for example, YouTube had to go for a week without any new content, it would be a very big deal, right? And so that's happened to the various Chinese equivalents of YouTube. So there's something called PotatoNet Tudouang, which is one of the biggest video host sites in China. On a number of occasions, they've had to just shut down for a week or two because of so-called discipline violations. So yeah, it's unfortunate.
Right.
I think.
Are there any clear examples of other countries utilizing these same methods of uncertainty and control variables in the way that China has?
In the paper, we have an example from Azerbaijan where there were two bloggers in Azerbaijan, which is an authoritarian Central Asian country, who. So for some reason, the Azeri government had a program to import foreign donkeys. No one is quite sure why. Azerbaijan apparently has no shortage of homegrown donkeys, so no one could quite figure out why these donkeys were being imported. So two bloggers made fun of this. Like, why are we importing all of these donkeys when we have plenty at home? They were punished, but in the same way the government never said why, right? They'd done some other kind of pranky things, and so everyone assumed it was because of the donkey story, but there were other stories they could have gotten in trouble for as well. Right. So that's an example that's in the paper. Other countries do similar things as well. The Egyptian government, for example, is sort of increasingly trying to control its own internet, I think with some of the same techniques. I'm not a Middle Easternist, so I don't know the details of the Egyptian system, but during the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, the then dictator Hosni Mubarak, in the middle of the protests, turned off Egypt's internet completely, just shut down the entire internet in Egypt. Turned out it was probably a bad idea. It made a lot of people very angry, and they took to the streets instead of complaining online. But it's a clear example that other countries are looking toward and often adopting and buying China's censorship techniques or software to implement at home.
Right. So we hear a lot about China through the media and from politicians, and a lot of stuff from a lot of people, and myself included. It's hard to know what's accurate or what's the full story or all that. What are certain things that you hear from the media and from politicians that you say that's perfectly accurate, and what are some things you say that's not right at all?
I mean, anyone who talks about like the Chinese communists are being at best inaccurate and at worst lying or disingenuous. China has, yes, it's ruled by a dictatorship that calls itself the Communist Party and traces its roots back into the 1920s, but China hasn't really been communist since the 1980s. This is a capitalist system, right? It's a communist in name only. A dictatorship, yes. Communist, hardly. So that's one. Another sort of thing is that there's a general perception that the central government in China is all powerful, that it can do whatever it wants, that Xi Jinping can just snap its fingers and make anything happen. And that's true issue to issue. I don't want to deny it, but China has a lot of issues, and central government attention and power is limited. The analogy I always use is that you can imagine if Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, is in a colossal, enormous warehouse, completely dark and totally full of problems. Problems everywhere you look. He's got a flashlight. He can point the flashlight at a particular problem, and with sustained attention, he can solve whatever problem he's looking at, right? Corruption in Anhui province, a particular mayor who's acted out. Modernizing the Chinese submarine forces. Whatever problem he's picking, he can solve. But in the meantime, there are a million other problems that he's not solving and can't solve because attention and essentially bandwidth in the central government is limited. The central government in China is actually very tiny relative to the size of the population. So an economist named Christine Wong estimates that there are perhaps only about 10,000 people in the central level ministries in Beijing. This is tiny. I mean, to put it in perspective, the Department of Agriculture in its Washington, D.C. offices alone has something like 8,000 employees. So the entire Chinese central government, is only 25 or 30% larger than the Ag Department is in the United States, just with its D.C. employees, right? To give another example, a majority of tax revenue that provinces get comes from block grants from the central government. Generally speaking, the Chinese tax system is complicated, but generally speaking, the way it works is that the central government collects taxes and then it kicks money back down. Okay. This money comes in the form of enormous block grants. The number of officials who oversee the distribution of a multi-hundred billion dollar U.S. dollar distribution of tax revenue to China's 37 provincial units every year is apparently the number of officials who oversee this is apparently 4. 4 officials oversee the distribution of something like $300 billion in tax revenue. And so, of course, there's no oversight, right? The whole thing leads to lots of corruption. Mm-hmm. So in other words, this is true for historical reasons. The Chinese government 1,000 years ago was also very tiny per capita, and for various reasons it's still very small today. And so we think about the central government as being able to do whatever it wants. Actually, it's very small, right. And it can do whatever it wants, but on one thing. But the other 99 things, it's just ignored.
Right. For those who are listening who want to learn more about the Chinese government, any of the topics we've talked about, what are some good sources for them to look at?
Yeah, there's a book where I actually got this information about the 4 officials who oversee the block grants. There's a guy called Arthur Krober who's done. He's a consultant in China for many years. He's been there for decades, and he wrote a book called How China's Economy Works, which is a really great sort of beginner to intermediate level overview of the Chinese economy, which is it's very, very good. The Chinese political system sort of is more on the textbook side and less interesting. There's a guy called Jonathan Spence who's a recently retired historian at Yale who's probably the foremost contemporary Western historian of China, and his books are always great. He's got a sort of a quasi textbook called The Search for Modern China, which is very long and very dense, but also has all kinds of fabulous. He's also a great writer. He sort of reads like a novel.
Okay.
So those are good places to start.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure.